So we're now moving to, it seems like there are yet one more essential issue as we think about a city and about cities of the future. And we've covered, one might imagine, every conceivable topic, but yet there's one more that we haven't really touched on, and that's transportation, and clearly an essential part of our future cities. So please welcome our panel from Manhattan, Global Real Estate Director, Managing Director from JP Morgan. No, that was our last panel. I like them so much that we're going to bring them back. How about this? Why don't we, well, they're not talking about transportation at all. Yes, they are, of course they are. So the managing principal of Kohn Pedersen Fox, Paul Katz, from, I assume, here in New York, from a vice president from transportation at Parsons, Kevin Thibault, author and professor at New York University, Anthony Townsend, and the panel chair is the executive director of the Regional Plan Association, Tom Wright. Talk to us about transportation, Tom. All right.
Thanks, Ron. Good to see you. Hey. Thank you to the audience and everybody for staying with us. We are the last panel, but we did save the best for last. And I'd say even just out in the hallway, we were kind of talking in anticipation of this and started a lively little debate among ourselves. So I'm going to encourage everybody else to join in now, and we'll kind of mix it up. And actually that last panel really ended, I think, on a good note in terms of talking about climate change and needing to come up with new ways of mobility and moving people around and connecting communities, rich and poor, in more sustainable and climate-friendly ways. I think everybody in this room probably knows what's happening to the trends right now. We're all very familiar with the history of urbanization and metropolitan development and transportation in the United States. In the middle of the last century, we built a massive interstate highway system, and then we spent 50 years building out around that system. Vehicle miles traveled increased, suburbanization. My organization, Regional Plan Association, became alarmed by what was going on and started in the 1950s and 60s to try and figure out how to get people back into cities. And for 30 or 40 years, we were swimming against the tide. And it kind of seemed as though there was just never going to be a recentering of metropolitan America, let alone the world. And it even seemed when we would travel around to the developing world that they were just going to follow under the same path that we had taken and make the same mistakes and end up with the same results. And then suddenly, somehow, probably sometime around the 1990s, and certainly by the 00s, things changed. And we've started to see now that the trends are moving in a very different direction. Vehicle miles traveled is flat or declining. Bike share is up. Car share is up. We're using technology to use cars less. We're communicating with social media and personal things. Transit ridership is up. Amtrak, I think their ridership last year was the highest since 1950 or something like that. And in particular, transit ridership is up in reverse commutes and weekend commutes. And so it's a flatter demand curve, not so heavily peaked. New York City, of course, we're all extraordinarily proud of bike share coming here finally and the success that it's having. So we're seeing these trends almost seemingly overnight move in the right direction. And I think the first question I'll kind of put out to the panel, and maybe we'll start to go from here, is this an entire paradigm shift? Will historians look back at the 20th century and the second half of the 20th century as some strange anomaly that was off from a trend? Or are we just in a little statistical blip right now? And we ought to think that the vehicle miles traveled has more to do with the recession and some other trends that could turn around again in another year or two. Where do people think we're going, and where do they hope we'll go? Maybe if I can say too. And Paul, since you work on large cities and planning cities, and so in a way you're kind of responding to developers and seeing what they're asking for. What are people asking for now? And what do you think they will ask for in the future?
Well, I think hopefully we're designing cities around what cities need rather than what developers would like us to do. And I think very much developers are following general broad trends. And I do agree with you that we're seeing very positive signs in both developing countries and developed countries in the increase in the concept of the compact city, in the increase of densification, mixed use, and most importantly of all, walkability and creating small, compact, mixed-use neighborhoods. And so to answer your question, I would say that my hope is that the automobile, the 50 or 60 years that the automobile was dominant, it was rather the aberration and the blip in history rather than the reverse.
What do you, Kevin, do you agree with that? It was an aberration and a bad nightmare we're waking up from, or are we going to?
I tend to agree in some sense what Paul said, but I think, so for it to change is going to take a while because of everything we've put into place infrastructure-wise, and for us to reverse that trend or go back to a trend or go back to where we should have been we heard earlier, Seth talking about investment in this case, investment in infrastructure, and in order to be able to switch that trend instead of from the highway mode now to a different mode of transportation is going to take investment.
Sure.
And so it could be that we realize that the highway mode or the automobile was not the way to go and we want to shift it, but then we need to make an investment in a different mode that we're probably not ready to make yet, or we don't have the resources to make yet. So I think, I think that's a very good comment that Paul said, but I think the reality is, how do we get there?
Right.
How do we make that shift?
Right. Well, how about, Anthony, if I'll throw out, you work in technology and the intersection of technology in cities. That's an area where shifts happen very rapidly. What do you think is the relationship between the slow-moving, the planning and design of highways and mass transit and railroads with what you see happening on the technology side? How is that clash going to play out?
Well, I think it's really interesting that just as we sort of put the finishing touches on the interstate highway system in the mid-'80s, having spent something on the order of about $500 billion in today's dollars, we started building a totally different infrastructure that has really profound implications on mobility, and that's the cellular telephone network. And to date, the wireless industry has invested about $250 billion in that infrastructure. So by the end of this decade, if not sooner, the public cellular networks in North America will be worth about as much as the highway system, the amount of capital that's gone in. And they are having a profound impact on travel generation, travel demand, how we structure our trips, the kinds of things that we're able to do, and all the sort of synchronization of different activities in the city. And if you look in your pocket, this thing is basically the same computing power as the Cray 1 that was installed at Los Alamos in 1973, the year that I was born, to model nuclear explosions. And that's in your pocket now, and it's not modeling nuclear explosions. It's figuring out your calendar, figuring out how to get you to where you want to be across whatever modes are available. Talking to a data center that's giving you predictions about when you're going to get there, pulling real-time schedules and vehicle locations from your transit agency to give you complete certainty. And all those things are changing the experience of how we move. I think in many cases making transit and other methods of travel more appealing than driving. But in other cases, I think sort of extending the lifetime of the automobile. The way I like to think of it is that mobile communications both catalyzes density. It's the reason why New York and Hong Kong and Paris can still function and are so productive. But it's also sort of a substrate for sprawl, right? It makes traffic congestion so much less costly and so much easier to avoid.
To handle.
Yeah.
Well, what do you think? I've actually spent time looking at transit systems around the world, and it often seems as though the uptake of technology in other transit systems, you're working in very modern cities in Asia and all over the place, they're being much more aggressive, it seems to me, in trying to integrate transit and technology. Does that mean we'll have an opportunity to leapfrog over them later and let them make the mistakes, or are we kind of embedded in an old system? Is it going to be harder for us to adapt, say?
Well, we have no choice. So I think it's not just the emerging countries in Asia that are moving forward, but you go to London and they're investing in Crossrail and all sorts of great programs. And if you look at the way the cities, both developing, Asian developed cities and European cities have changed in the last 20 years,
Sure.
and their position relative to the cities of the United States, just in terms of infrastructure. I'm not comparing it in other social movements, which of course the United States has a long lead on.
Okay.
There's no reason we could not improve many areas, but we obviously the things that are holding us back are clearly political problems and social problems or cultural problems.
Right.
But why I say we have no choice, because sooner or later, I believe we're going to have to adapt. And I think a city like New York has adapted more than other cities in the United States and has seen the benefits of that adaptation. And in my own non-expert view on what's happening in other cities in the United States, those that are following what's happening in New York are going to be ahead and maybe even be able to compete with New York and some of the advantages we've developed in the last decade.
Right. Well, I think all of us who kind of remember New York City in the 1970s know that we couldn't have the success that we have today if we still had, say, the subway system that we had then. But there's definitely a resource issue which is going to come to the table, and it's been mentioned a few times here. We see, as we were talking about outside, we essentially fund much of our transportation network out of the gas tax, and between kind of a flattening vehicle miles traveled and improved CAFE standards, so cars going farther on a gallon of gas, and gas taxes. The last time the federal gasoline tax was raised was in Bill Clinton's first budget, I think. So we don't seem to be, we've kind of run the numbers at RPA looking at what we think it'll do to New York State, and we think over the next 15 years or so it could be as much as a 30% reduction in the purchasing power of the gas tax. So resources, if anything, seem to be going down. Kevin, are you seeing some cities that are...
Sorry, that's because people are driving less?
Yes.
Well, people are driving less.
Or they're consuming less fuel.
And they're going further on a gallon of gas.
Right, right. It's all based upon consumption.
Right. And
so
because the tax, of course, is a per gallon as opposed to a sales tax, it's not protected against inflation either. So all those things work against it. So where do you see resources kind of coming from if we're going to address this?
Well, there's been a lot of discussion on the local and national level on how do you replace that. That consumptive gas tax is regressive because of either less driving or more fuel efficient vehicles. The Nissan Leaf, which is a great electric car, doesn't have any huge carbon footprint and so on, pays zero for transportation. Right. They literally pay zero, but they use the highway just as much as you and I do.
Right.
And so
bastards.
Those people, right? Why don't they get that Escalade out there? I used to tell people all the time when I knew we had a problem with the gas tax, when I saw the Super Bowl MVP get a Cadillac Escalade hybrid. I said, so we went from 2 miles per gallon to 4 miles per gallon. But in any sense, so we have to, again, as we talk about paradigm shift and how we use transportation and what we use as our mode of transportation, there'll need to be a paradigm shift in how we fund transportation.
Right.
And so as we were talking with Paul and others earlier today, I mean, on the federal level, 18 cents a gallon is what you pay for your gas tax. And if you think about it and you start to dice it and figure out, well, how many miles do I drive a year and so on, you're paying about $9 to $11 a month, depending on how your usage, for your transportation on the highway mode. That's pretty cheap. Think about it, $9 to $11 a month. Those of you who love Starbucks, I'm a Dunkin' Donuts guy, so I'm a little different group here. How much do you pay for your Starbucks a day? $9 to $11 a month for your transportation. So we got a shift.
Right.
It's a paradigm shift. And you've heard cases we've talked about, or you've heard cities like, we talk about cities, right? That
sure.
changed their paradigm. And Portland, Oregon would be one of those cities that have changed their paradigm. I mean, they have developed a system there that then land use is kind of controlled in that urban boundary, and they developed a network of transportation modes within that urban boundary. And they were kind of for vision of looking at changing the way we fund transportation. So they had that pilot on the use of fee and vehicle miles traveled and so on. A lot of people are concerned about that because of tracking and traveling and all that stuff. But whatever the mode is, we have to consider it's got to be a change. We've got to think about how do we change that funding source. But in order for us to do that, is we got to start with education. Because just like you were talking about earlier, Paul, about people don't realize really how much they're paying for it, how it's funded. When they see the gas go up to $4 a gallon or whatever they think that the coffers are increasing. When in reality it's not, because most people tend to consume less, right? So it's got to start with the education before you can start making that paradigm shift. Is it a vehicle miles traveled? Do you pay for your transportation like a utility, like you pay for your water and your electricity? Perhaps some people look for that, but it has to be a change somewhere.
So there's actually that idea of transportation as a utility or mobility as a utility. Tony Hsieh, who is the CEO and founder of Zappos.com, which is an online shoe retailer, recently relocated his headquarters to downtown Las Vegas, bought a bunch of property, and is basically trying to rebuild downtown Las Vegas as a walkable, sustainable, hip community. And so there's a big economic development component to it. And there's a big transportation piece to it that they're calling Project 100. And basically what Project 100 is going to be is they just bought 100 Teslas. So they're going to have 100 shared electric vehicles parked around the district. They're going to have an on-demand electronic hail taxi service like Uber. And they're going to have a bike share system. So there'll be multi-modes of travel. I think there's even like an airport service. So basically you just figure out where you want to go. And there's an app that's going to tell you how to get there, what the choices are. And I think those kinds of, the automobile is going to be here for a while, but there's a tremendous amount of business model innovation going on around how we manage our automobiles and how we share them and how we route them. And I think, it's a much more kind of bootstrapped, smaller scale project than rethinking an entire metropolitan area. But it shows you how you can sort of leverage a comprehensive land use, transportation, economic change, using technology to stitch it all together.
Well, I'm curious as you're talking, I remember once it really had a profound impact on me hearing one of the folks at Toyota who'd helped develop the Prius, and they kind of said, look, there are two challenges to what we want to do, and one is the battery question and getting the batteries to be light enough, and we're here and we need to go here, and I can tell you we'll invest X amount every year, and I can give you with a lot of confidence when we'll get to where we need to be. And then the other is social acceptance of the electric and the idea that you can't jump in your car in New York City and drive to California and know that you can just recharge everywhere, on gas without having to wait or anything. Even though, I don't know about you guys, I've never done that.
Well,
I
that's
can.
the point. But because, I think the social, cultural changes that are happening, how many people dream of driving to California anymore? And that's the fundamental thing. And if in Tokyo, for example, young people don't buy cars anymore. That's how many, even if they gave them away, who wants to really, what young person who's smart wants to own 2,000 pounds of metal and be responsible for it when you don't need to? And I think in the future, people are going to ask themselves that question.
Okay, so
maybe you don't have that many possessions anymore because these are big changes. So the most valuable thing you have in your life is your time, and why people want to sit on a highway listening to music when they could be, walking and working and thinking and reading. That's why I say the automobile is an aberration, not the norm. And we're one of the last countries to not realize that.
If anyone disagrees, I'll ask them to come up to the. But you know what? This is getting way too optimistic. So let me throw a little wrench into the works here. So yesterday I came back from 2 days ago I went down to Philly for another conference. And rode the Amtrak down. Because if I'm not going to drive, and I don't drive to California, but I travel quite a lot between Boston and Washington, let's say. And as we know, 2/3 of the people these days traveling between Washington and New York, and Boston are riding Amtrak as opposed to flying. So we've got the market share. So the Amtrak train was packed. People were standing in the aisles between Trenton and Philadelphia trying to find seats. And to get back to that resource issue, obviously we ought to have high-speed rail in the Northeast corridor. We should be going at 180 miles an hour plus between Boston and Washington. We know that, and yet I have very little confidence that that's going to happen anytime too soon. We don't seem to have the resources, the institutional framework. So before we all get very happy and that things are going, where are we going to? What's it going to take? Because even if we make this transition, we're going to need to invest in some heavy infrastructure. It's not all going to be a bank coming in and sponsoring our bike share program and essentially doing. I mean, we're very proud in New York that it didn't cost any public money. Part of me thinks, shouldn't we be willing to pay for this if it's so good? So what do we think about, are we going to have city high-speed rail sometime soon, or who's going to help pay for that?
Next question. Listen, I'm from Florida. I live in Florida, so we've been through that rodeo before. Look at so we talked about the highway mode, right? But how did we get to the interstate system? It took vision, it took leadership, it took a bunch of group together to say we need to do this. We need to be able to move people and goods from city to city and so on, right? And by the way, we haven't talked about the goods part, because moving goods is also a big equation here.
Absolutely.
So, and that's going to take even more of a shift.
Is there an app for that?
Yeah. So I think it's going to, eventually you're going to have to get to the point that the other mode, the rail mode, the passenger rail mode has to be brought up. It's going to take that vision, it's going to take that leadership to get that done. When is it going to happen? It can't start on a regional level, unfortunately. I think it needs to start in somewhat of a federal level to get some guidance.
Really? Okay.
Because we're still too parochial in some cases.
To be willing to do this. Yeah.
Well, I think it's going to be cultural. I think that these sort of cultural things take care of themselves to a large degree. And one of the aspects is, we've also seen sort of the reverse in the culture. In the last generation, the average size of a home in America has doubled.
Right.
The amount of waste has doubled. There are a lot of things that are going to improve, and trends start because that's the right thing to do, and the society, the culture corrects itself. I don't think it's something that always comes from experts sitting in rooms and saying, we'll adjust the tax and then everybody's going to do this. The reason people are moving to cities is because it's more productive to be in cities. And I'll give you an example. In the past, many of the mixed-use projects we designed, the office buildings house financial service tenants.
Sure.
And everybody had this idea that through the internet, all the IT companies were going to live in suburbia and never come to the city. But the reality is, whether it's London, New York, Tokyo, the best tenants and the tenants that are driving the growth are the IT and media companies. And so this very large project we did in Tokyo, which is full of banks, is now emptying out. It's a mixed-use project in the middle of Tokyo, and is being filled by both Chinese, Asian, and Western media companies. And those are the tenants of choice, because those are the young people that are imaginative and creative.
Well, can I turn that on its head? If you're saying that it's not going to be led by the institutional sector, and I agree with that. In some ways, I think there can also be a danger that the institutional sector is not able to transform itself fast enough to keep up. I still remember back when I was in college, a former chair of the City Planning Commission in New York telling me that the most successful land use policy of New York City in the 60s and 70s was probably what he called lax enforcement. Because if they had been enforcing the zoning codes, you'd never have Soho, for instance. But I wonder sometimes are we, as the social change is kind of pushing and this bottoms-up change happening, are we not able, are the institutions not able to to either be lax enough or agile enough to keep up with it.
I mean, if I could chime in on that, I mean, I think there's a looming crisis in transportation planning that's going to be driven by a lot of these, startup, entrepreneurial-driven innovations that are allowing people to make their own choices about how they use the transportation system to get the mobility that they want. So think like intelligent transportation systems, right? This is the whole body of research and development that has been being pushed over the last 20 years to essentially instrument the whole transportation system with sensors and controllers, so that we can kind of, this I'm going to sit at a dashboard and run the whole transportation system from City Hall or wherever. And California, for example, spent hundreds of millions of dollars putting hockey pucks in the highways, every quarter mile, so that they could measure traffic speed at a fairly coarse resolution. And then, in the span of a decade, that is all completely invalidated, because we can now just pull the traces off of mobile phones and commercial fleet GPS trackers and do much finer grain predictive traffic.
Why do you say crisis? I mean, isn't that a good thing that it's moving ahead, or?
Right, okay, so first of all,
a lot of planners will be embarrassed?
That system just sort
We're used to it, trust me.
You're right, I'm just saying that system sort of magically appeared.
Sure.
So that was transportation planners got lucky. They didn't design that.
Yeah.
And there's a whole number of companies like AirSage, which is based out of Atlanta now, that are using this mobile network exhaust data to provide planning tools. But then you just look at sort of some of the regulatory conflicts that are happening, like around electronic hailing, around congestion pricing and political failures there. And it seems to me there's a lot of evidence that transportation planners are going to be in a very reactive position. And then when you look at how people are using mobile technologies to plan their day, and sort of the travel demand functions that are going on there, they're very poorly understood, and they're changing very, very quickly. So you've got this sort of like moving wavefront of change in travel behavior that it's very hard to understand.
I think that's an interesting one.
But people are using their time more effectively. So that's one of the reasons people are moving back into the city, because many of the impediments that we've created can be overcome with these things. So you can, you go to a city you don't know, and you can plan your time, and you know where you are. You get lost less. So when you go to Venice, you can do it in a day, not in 5 days. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So there's a beauty to all of this, and I think the cities are going to survive, and they're going to be just as exciting with or without these things. And I think they're more exciting, more accessible because of all this technology, and that's why people are capable. I mean, one of the things is that the reason the cities sprawl happened also because of technology, because it was unhealthy to live in the cities. It was more healthy to live outside and to separate all the functions. The biggest sort of revolution that's happened in the last 100 years is not the automobile, but the fact that we can all live, work, and flourish in a density that was unsustainable 50 years ago, 100 years ago. So if you ask if there's a shift, there's this massive shift that we can live so much better today, so much closer to each other because of in the cities.
Absolutely.
And that's the most important thing. And so this transportation doesn't necessarily have to drive it.
Yeah. I saw somebody at a podium, but I've lost them now, and it's dark.
Come back.
Oh, well, I think we have another minute or two. Make it a quick question, and we'll try and address it. Oh.
So, just wondering that while we talk here about, say, how, as one example, the United States might shift from over-reliance on the car, the personal car, to rapid transit, when you get a country like China that isn't encumbered by things like Congress, they can have a meeting like this and 7 people can decide what they're going to do, and they actually just make it happen and have environmental reviews over a glass of wine or a beer. So it's much more efficient. What they're doing, though, is not saying we're just going to have rapid transit or we're just going to have short-haul transportation vehicles. What they're designing is a highway system that, when built out within 10 years, will miniaturize the US highway system. And they're going to have vehicles going all over the place. They have a rapid train setup that is going to miniaturize what Europe has. It is just going to be astonishing and is on its way.
Right.
So within 10 years, they will have done everything that would streamline the movement of people rather than vehicles, yet they're also building an amazing infrastructure to move vehicles long haul. And that's not about goods, that's about people.
Right.
So why, when they've got all the benefit of all the sort of the cock-ups that we've seen, say in Europe and in the US, why are they putting in place a system that has both of them, neither to the exclusion of the other? And that's the long, short version of the question.
Well, you've only got 7 people to ask.
Well, I get the efficiency of putting it in place. It's just that philosophically, clearly, they're building the most sustainable cities in the world. They are building cities that no matter what New York does, or LA does, or San Francisco does, or Vancouver does, we will never, ever be able to be what they're building from the ground out with 3 million people here and 10 million people there, and they're building them, and they will be at such an advanced stage. So they've got the cities. They're not trying to retrofit anything. But my question is, why are they putting in place a vehicle-friendly national transportation setup when you
Well, are they
guys are
willing
talking
to do
about
that?
I'll take a
modified?
quick crack at that. I mean, the economic problem with China is a lack of domestic demand, and one industrial good that people have shown they'll buy as many as you can supply is automobiles. So I think in terms of sort of keeping the economy afloat, keeping the auto industry growing is a really important part of their industrial policy. Whether it's good urban planning,
Right.
I don't know.
I guess I would say, what's the famous story that the first steamships also had masts on them? We kind of, before we moved to one technology, we still stay on to the old one. And there is, and in a broader sense, I think part of the argument is that everything that's happening today, as Anthony said, and I think everyone would agree, we're not planning to throw away our car keys anytime too soon. Right. It's just a diminution of its role in our own lives. And there are more complementary ways of traveling and living and working. But there will still always be a role.
Yeah, it's not necessarily, I mean, we tend to have this idea that I don't think the United States should, and I don't think that was the implication of the gentleman's question, we should be thinking about what they're doing, although we could be learning from them the way they do study us. And I think implementation of some of these changes of transportation and lifestyle issues happen quite quickly. And I tend to look at, tend to think that we should look at what the transformations that have happened in Japan over the last 50 years, from both in terms of pollution and both in terms of congestion in traffic. And I think maybe the Chinese are looking at Japan to answer this gentleman's question as I'm thinking, because Japan also developed an auto industry and a rapid transportation system at the same time, at a parallel time, and were highly polluted. So I would suggest, if you take a snapshot of Japan in the 60s or 70s and look at where they are today, maybe the Chinese are looking to do the same thing and be more like Japan than like us, or a future version of Japan.
I have to say, I've done a lot of panels on transportation issues, and this is by far the most optimistic one I've ever participated in. I don't know why.
That's because you had an architect.
I had an architect on the panel. Always keep an architect sitting right next to you. It just brightens things up. Thanks so much to everybody in the audience for staying, and thanks to this great panel for a fun conversation. And I think we're going to hand it off. That was fun. Thank you.